I'm an artist and an activist. I'm also a scholar. I guess it is within these three positionalities that I see my work. I guess to prime the context of my work in relation to the exhibition, I say that I am peasant and indigenous peoples advocate, which means that I recognize that the majority of our population is within the peasant sector, and including indigenous minorities, fisher folk, and farm workers. And that these this sector, or they have the least access to resources and basic services. Most of them are landless or being displaced by development projects and plantations. And most of them are hungry. Our food producers are hungry, as our country, an agricultural country, supposedly imports rice and fish. We're an archipelago that imports fish. So all of this is rooted into the policies that binds us into technically just the receiving end of what we know as capitalism and imperialism. Um, so it is with the peasants and indigenous minorities and workers and their collective struggle for liberation that I put my solidarities into. And I extend my solidarities to the peasants and indigenous minorities and workers all over the world, particularly in the global south. So I guess it is within this recognition that I say, like, I am involved within the farmers at large. But within that, I guess, like, I'm also a member of the collective called SACA, or Sama-samang Artista para sa Kilusang Agrario, which is an anti-feudal alliance of artists and cultural workers and knowledge workers for genuine agrarian reform and rural development in the Philippines. I think a lot of my work is at large collaborative. There's nothing you can do alone, really. In terms of my collaboration with Henry, which as he signs Henricus. Kasi yun nga, like I would run a lot of text through Google Translate. Tapos nasama ko yung Cian x Henry. Tapos naging Cian x Henricus. And then from there, parang natawa na lang kami, and then he stuck by it. So Henry is an embroiderer in Pasig, Palenque, who I've been working with since 2016 or so. Yeah, so it's their family business, and then he has a stall at the market. But then I work with him exclusively in terms of embroidery work. I sketch out the images and text with crayon on on curtains or fabric that are stretched onto the wall, and then he traces it. So it's been an evolving pattern of collaboration since the past couple of years, and he has a lot of space to be intuitive with how he interprets the crayon drawings on the work. But I guess besides all of this parang technical aspects, he started out as somewhat of an audience or a reader or a viewer to the work which he traces himself. So in a way, we've developed this sort of like push and pull, or like critique, and like wherein he takes this like position of like, oh kuya, what does this mean? So we welcome that. We welcome that sort of friendly interrogation into what he's tracing and what he's being paid to trace, actually. His involvement within a process that is deliberately political and like artistic in a, together. So a lot of my work are in response or in reference to, I guess, to the material and visual culture of specific times, particularly in tapestry. When I started doing textile work, I was inspired with the antiquarian maps, which I've been looking into in different archives. But at the same time, I'm fascinated with the idea of the European medieval tapestries, which traditionally would represent landscapes or maps that would depict the territory of the landowner. So they were technically the material culture of feudalism at its peak. So with me referencing that particular visual and material culture, I am attempting to subvert this imagery and materiality into making anti-feudal work, into addressing the legacies of such like economic practice and how it persists today. Yeah, I was trained as a painter, and a lot of the things I do, we do DIY. So we don't really stop consulting and collaborating with different people. And in terms of the wood carving sculptures, I also have collaborators in Paete, which, as we know, is a town in Laguna that is known for its wood carving, which roots back, which is rooted into the colonial times, wherein they would be commissioned to do religious sculptures and with iconography of Catholicism. So their practice is mostly based on the production of objects for votive functions. Yeah, santo, ganyan. In a way, I also take that into context and subvert and use my collaboration to subvert it into making objects of protest or resistance, or at least like symbolizing struggle in collaboration with hands and minds that produce objects for votive or worship functions. So I'll start with a scene in the tapestry. The scene is referenced from an etching of European conquests to the New World, which is what we know as America. So I usually reference from these images, that are etchings or like map cartouches. Try to relate their original context into what I'm talking about now. So the whole idea of context in relation to the exhibition, the whole idea of conquest, sorry, in relation to the exhibition ground control has a lot to do with conquest and domination and land accumulation. There's that little area where there's a globe with labeled continents, which was originally Europe and Asia, and then I had turned into Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which I guess roughly and geographically refers to mostly what is global south, no? Which is more of an economic term relating to what is in the receiving end. So I had referenced and parang taken from that image as a prompt or a springboard to depict like the global south as a region, because there are also characters which I had labeled like agrochemical corporations or like slavers or the parang military industrial complex and large multinational corporations. So parang they're also somewhat modern contemporary conquistadors, if you will, in the sense of vast accumulation of land for capitalist industrial agricultural industries. So like mainly talking about speaking within the context of plantation monocrop plantations. Other Latin texts that we see within the composition. I usually use Latin as a way to subvert this archaic language of dominant culture. So I use Latin as a base of this subversion that I try to do. And in a way, it's also like mockery because I use Google Translate to play around these words. So sometimes like I have like phrases or statements or even like jokes that I run into Google Translate, and then that's the text into Latin, and then that's the text that I use into the compositions. So the text there, Atlas Globalis, yeah, it basically reads in English, Atlas of the Global South, no justice, no peace on stolen land, which I thought would also work well as somewhat of a book cover. No, I guess like as I'm referencing into this etching that is part of a book, like I'm also imagining this composition not just as a textile embroidery, but also in different formats, which I think is also definitive of like my trail of thought as I'm trying to compose images. I'm wanting to like fit the images into different formats that could live on after the production of the work itself or the exhibition itself. The upside down map of Southeast Asia is also referenced from a Dutch colonial map of the region of the Southeast Asian region. Um, yeah, as we may know that the region has is like a big factor within European expansion, starting from the mercantilist tradition to what is now capitalist and imperialist. So like our region has been largely exploited for its resources and its people. My practice also recognized the function and role of maps within that expansionist thinking and the entirety of the colonial projects. So what I did was I selected a sample, a Dutch map of the region, and then in a way try to subvert it from the base. So initially, it was to turn the Southeast Asia map upside down in a way to somehow disorient its function and also to subvert its original intent from colonizing to decolonizing, if you will. It doesn't exactly, other than it being a trace of landforms within the region, it doesn't exactly function as a map, in a sense that it doesn't exactly tell us where is where or which is which, but rather more of like a banner that states its solidarity or resistance to its original supposed function. So, for example, all the little images that I had scattered all over the waters and the landforms are depicting specific themes or industries such as like extractive industries and large scale minings as represented by the like mouth with teeth looking symbols, and then the others are like specific plants or crops that are monocrops of plantations that are scattered throughout the region for the consumption of to supply the global supply needs, if you will. So yeah, we see there pineapples and sugarcane and banana and oil palm, as well as other like monster like characters, which, as we may recognize in a Western cartographic tradition, monsters are used to depict what is unknown or what is not to be known um, in maps. So I sort of use this to kind of deliberately portray what we actually do know. For example, the dragon in the South China Sea, or the eagle with a star um, at the east of the Philippine archipelago, which is somewhat um, in relation to the influence of the United States within the region as well. And then you have very um, clear banners that are, like I said, like the work is more of a banner than a that happens to take the format of a map, because you have I mean you see the words land to the tillers and agrarian agrarian revolution is justice, which I think pretty much encapsulates the entire ethos of the exhibition. The original image is also in reference to a medieval etching. On top is our letters that spell out plantation scene. So the plantation scene is a response to what is widely talked about as the Anthropocene, which is known to be like an era in Earth's geology wherein humanity or civilizations directly affect geological phenomena such as global warming, climate change, ganyan. But the plantation scene, or sometimes plantationocene, is kind of a response to this, to the limitations of Anthropocene, because it also recognizes that humanity or civilization isn't just one unit. It doesn't function as one entity that directly affects geo global geological phenomenon, but rather it identifies colonialism and capitalism and racial hierarchies as the key factors that affect such global geological phenomena such as global warming and climate change. So it sort of shifts the direction, the discourse from climate change to climate justice, because it identifies like key players or aspects within our contemporary society that is actually responsible for these changes in our geology. So that word plantation scene, which is I guess relatively new in scientific discourse, but I like to try to address within this work, and I guess in the rest of the show, or my trail of thought is how, for example, the exploitation of workers here in the Philippines or in the global South, um, in relation to serving the global supply chain. How is this relationship affecting the how is this relationship affecting geological and geographical phenomenon? How is this in relation to climate justice and injustice globally? So yeah, as we can see that there are a lot of texts and images scattered around the composition within the pig, which yeah, I think I had mentioned was a also in reference to a medieval image of like allegorical figures within like the pig outline. But these texts and images are like talking about different like details or factors or angles in which we can try to interrogate these topics of inequality and the plantation scene and climate justice and all of those stuff. So in a way, it's like a hodgepodge of little hyperlinks that I invite the viewers to look into. In a way, a lot of these works are also like working outlines for myself as I try to sort immerse myself within these discourses, these narratives from on the ground oral tradition and memories and experiences of peasant farmers and indigenous people to more systematic historical patterns within um, a global scale. So how do we sort of try to marry all these different meanings and all these different narratives into our own understanding? At the bottom, there is a text which is like Pig One PML Worldview. Pig One is just me playing around with Figure One, since it's a pig. And then PML Worldview is Panginoong May Lupa or Landlord. So if anything, I'm just yeah, trying to frame it with my idea of like like a large land owning worldview based on the idea of extraction and accumulation. Other than like me taking from the medieval reference, I'm riding on with the metaphor of the pig as like I guess like as an ubiquitous character for excess opulence ganyan. So yeah, monuments to for a silent night is in response to that specific incident of the felling of trees for the construction of like an additional parking lot within SM Baguio. So I'm not from Baguio myself. I just happen to have had like a project or a show at that time, but I also somehow took it as an opportunity to make something in response. I guess it somehow um, thinks about this whole idea of monument making or meaning making, but at the same time within like the ruins or detritus of what is our idea of development. So not only within the Duterte regime, but like way before, like we've been faced with the contradiction of development when we are asked like development for whom really. So with projects like infrastructure projects, like for example, build, supposedly making infrastructure and energy projects, but then like when we ask at what cost really, we're sort of like faced with the wall. So anyway, like going back to monuments for a silent night, these different contradictions on on the discourse on development will always depend on whose parameters or whose categories or of development we are subscribing to, 'di ba? So as long as we orient ourselves with the idea of development of people from the ground, there parang walang there will be a more parang just and equitable um, moves towards development that is based on the needs of the people, not the needs of profit. So this work, which is quite literal actually, tree stumps scattered on the floor, were just my little way of trying to add to this discourse. I mean, it's all done. The trees are cut, the parking lot is up. But in a way, this is me also trying to reframe that little gesture or that little installation in an obscure place in Baguio back into my trail of thought now, possibly with a different audience, but also in a different context and also in Caravan, diba? So parang like it's also a confrontation, no? Parang like who are we developing for, and who is all this for anyway, no? Yeah, I guess it's also like a political move that is assertive to bring it here, but at the same time, it it adds context to the exhibition ground control. After I showed it in Baguio in 2017, I technically forgot about it. So they just put it out of the gallery, and then the moss is not deliberate, it's natural. But um, I guess it adds to the materiality of the work, which is in itself concrete, no? Parang you make a remnant of an organic material out of concrete, which is like half organic, half synthetic, but very much a metaphor of development and civilization today. Semento, di ba? Sementadong gubat, ganyan. And then comes the moss, which was not deliberate, but very much welcome. And at the same time, like I guess in itself invites us to notice it and notice how parang time will time and memory will inevitably creep back into our own original ideas of, things such as development and struggle. I mean, like, if you take a step back and thinking about, like, climate climate change, climate justice, global warming, and then you realize that you're starting to imagine what the end of the world might be. And then some will argue that, yeah, you can imagine the end of the world, but you can't imagine the end of capitalism. But beyond all of that is that the world won't really end. Like like maybe our race will end because yeah, because like we won't survive this, but like the world will thrive with or without us. I guess like I took the opportunity to contextualize these two projects within October Peasant and Indigenous Peoples Month, which I mean wasn't too big of a call in a sense that these issues are what I have been thinking about, reading about, talking about within my practice for quite some time. So these two projects are hand in hand. The project in Kaida is entitled Rural Vistas. Basically, it responds to Western art historical canons on easel paintings and how these have influenced depictions of the rural landscape in the Philippines. Technically, the works challenge representations of traditional Philippine art through the lens of peasant struggles and the semi-feudal condition. So there were like um, my take on the landscape, on the still life, on the genre. And so it's a painting show basically. Um, and with that, this show in AI entitled Ground Control presents visualizations of the legacies of feudal relations as witnessed in the regions of the global south. Tapos, we can say that we try to orient our perspectives to rather subaltern populations of rural workers generationally exploited to serve the global supply chain through capitalist extraction of cheap labor and natural resources. Pretty much sums up the parang ethos of this project. Pero parang I guess within that, parang there's also this constant subversion of the material and visual culture of empire. Yun nga, yung feudal tapestries, yung allegorical etchings commemorating conquest and monuments of establishment, ganyan. So yeah, I think like sometimes the titling of the work is also like my way of trying to explain, but at the same time, I didn't want to be over didactic with how I presented the work. Which is also why, like in these two projects, instead of commissioning a writer or a curator to write about my work, instead I commissioned like writers to write poetry, instead of like a didactic exhibition text, which becomes rather part of the work rather than something that frames the work. So the two writers I had commissioned, they're also from Saka, so they're also peasant advocates such as myself. So they know about what I'm talking about, and they just sort of like add to it with language. Um, yeah, so it also adds to this idea of parang the show being more collaborative in terms of like how it's presented, how it's framed, and also how both are going to live on after the exhibitions, I guess. Kasi parang like as I was trying to think up of like installation formats, like I was just more concerned about how photogenic they would be. Because we have to recognize the importance of documentation and how the exhibitionary in general is also kind of limiting in terms of how many people are going to go there and the physical and visceral experience of being there. So we have to extend our work into the memory of it. So I guess with that being said as well, that's also definitive of my practice and artistic trail of thought as to how to historicize our own work, or at least like document it properly so we can make sense of it, or other people can make sense of it in the future. So yeah, I guess so for these two exhibitions together, I guess like a unifying theme is that they both parang interrogate the historical paradox of land use. No? Parang what is land use around ground control, or parang how are people or civilization or society, how much are we dependent on land to the point na do we know we're exploitative, or parang how conscious are we as individuals or as collectives to treat it ganyan. So yeah, so these views can be, I mean, this parang idea of land use can be viewed from like several points. From the rise of agricultural settlements to feudalism to like imperialist plunder, and maybe yung plantation scene, which is, I don't know if it's like a parang prophetic like projection or it's actually happening now, parang ganun. And yeah, these historical points are likewise experienced through various levels of narrative. Parang we experience it through policies and statecraft, ganyan, geopolitical patterns. Tas also yung personal oral traditions from the perspectives of the people on the ground, of the people who were deliberately silenced. So yeah, so basically the works in general in all of those two shows, they explore yung dynamic of power structures and resource distribution through the constant evaluation of rampant economic inequalities. I guess the short answer for that would be that there's no one person who can think up of a way. But we recognize our roles within it. So parang kuwari, like we're working within culture, and then this we're working within narratives, we're working within stories, diba? So I think parang it's important at this point to recognize that no parang individual genius can think up of like this setup that can fix the problems society has made, or historical flaws that have yet to be corrected. So when I made blah blah, I was trying to think up of like an imaginative past with the language of like a young Cian, which like when I read the stuff I wrote for blah blah, parang like sobrang cringe lang. But parang but it's funny. That it's funny, but because I'm sort of like reading myself, parang make piga my imagination. In terms of parang different levels of storytelling. But then from blah blah to ground control, I think I've grown in such a way that I need to recognize that I cannot like tell these stories on my own. And I have to look into um, collective stories of people, but also like to who I refer to is also a very much like a political gesture, because like I recognize no we need to recognize like an equal distribution of like a knowledge production, and what we know um, is created by who and for what. So parang I guess yeah, like from blah blah to ground control, it's really like I guess like a trail of thought in terms of like finding a roadmap into somewhat of an awakening. not to claim that I'm a woke guy totally, alam mo yun, pero alam mo yun, parang we need to look beyond ourselves basically. We need to look beyond ourselves and challenge what we do, so that it doesn't stay like put within um, within the confines of artistic practice and knowledge production. That we can and we should try to engage ourselves further, to find solidarities with people outside our bubbles.